take a fork in the road toward the Anselm Society Digital Pub. Inside is a raucous conversation on the arts, faith, and words that rhyme, words that don't rhyme, words with rhythm, words without rhythm. Is that a thing? I don't know. In the corner table by the fire are three people. One of them is trying really hard to find a word that rhymes with avocado. That's me, your host, Mandy Hauk. Welcome to Believe to See, a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. Here at Believe to See, we explore the relationship between faith, art, and storytelling. Our goal is to connect the great story, the great stories, and our own stories so that we can better understand what it means to live with a Christian imagination. And I just now realized that I said that there are three people by the fire. So I guess we are counting the teddy bear that I'm holding in my lap that my guest just said reminded her of Aloysius from Brideshead. So he is the third person, but he's going to be a silent partner because tonight I have the honor of interviewing solo one of my favorite wordsmiths and my dear friend, Jane Scharl. Welcome, Jane.
Thanks, Mandy. I'm so glad to be here.
I'm glad you're here. So Jane is published under the name J.C. Scharl. She is a poet, a playwright, and a critic. And we're going to talk about stuff she's done in the past, stuff she's got out there right now, and things she's working on for the future tonight. So get cozy. So Jane, tell us about your most recent published work, which is Pawns, a collection of poetry. Tell us how that came about and where our people can find it, and we'll remind them at the end.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, this is my debut poetry collection, which is actually nice to have out there because for years I've told people, oh, I write poetry, or oh, I'm a poet. And then they'd say, oh, do you have a book? And I have to say, no, I don't have a book out there. So it's really nice to have it out there. It actually came about through my a Master's of Fine Arts thesis. A lot of these poems are from that thesis, and then there's a lot of new ones. I completed my MFA in 2019, but there's a lot of poems that were in that I wrote during that program, and then I've been adding new ones. But a lot of the same themes are there. I was really trying to explore themes of home and stability and family as you go through the really big changes of life that happen in your 20s and 30s. So the collection really focuses on, it kind of walks through a year, and it's a year where I have a child and also my mother passes away. Mm-hmm. So it's a little bit of a fictive year because that really all took place over about 3 years, but I compressed it into a year just to keep it a little bit tight. So yeah, that's my first collection, Pawns, and it's available on Amazon, and it's published through the Poema poetry series at Whitfinstock. So you can also get it through their website if you prefer supporting the publisher directly.
That's what I did. I ordered 4 of them, and I got them all from there.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. Well, you went into the theme thing, which I really wanted to talk about more, particularly, you and I were just talking in the virtual green room about how the first poem that I read from this book, because there are multiple ways to approach an anthology, right? You can go to the table of contents and pick a title you like. You can just start from page 1. That is so not my jam. Or you can just open it randomly and find a poem. And as you know, the one that I found is the Hymn to a Box of Spaghetti. I'm messing up the title because it's a much longer title than that. But hymn to an open box of spaghetti as it falls from the pantry shelf. So that just happened to be the first one I read. And a few weeks ago, when you were here for a poetry reading, which I want to talk about in a little bit, I told your husband I liked that one. And I said I was imagining you in your little tiny home by the pond. Pond, hello, title of your Ponds. And I said I was picturing you like with the all the dried pasta falling and crashing. And he said that he thinks you wrote it much earlier than that. Is that correct?
I did. Yeah, I actually wrote it soon after we got married in Phoenix. So I wrote it in my tiny apartment in Phoenix in the middle of the summer with all the blinds closed because it was so hot all the
Oh,
time in Phoenix in the summer. And I wrote it because I was amazed at how I just couldn't believe how bright the noodles were in a room that was really pretty shaded because all the blinds were closed and stuff. It just really struck me. I can still picture they seemed like they were like lit from the inside somehow. It was
that,
some sort of weird trick of the light.
that comes through in the poem, even though I
Well,
didn't know
good.
that backstory, because you refer to them as like rays of light.
Yeah,
So I love that. So is that you mentioned that you wrote these, some are older and some are more recent. So
yeah,
how many years do you reckon this spans as far as your writing them?
yeah. That's a really good question. I'd say probably about 2016 through 2022.
Okay, that's
So
fair. Yeah, so that's
yeah, about 6
6 years.
years. Yeah,
And I remember because
maybe
we've
with
had you on the, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say maybe with one poem from 2023 in there, but I don't think so. Yeah,
Yeah. Um, so I know we've had you on the pod before in
yeah,
pre-2020 days. Um, and I remember you saying that one of your professors, because your poetry is very, it's form. You love form.
yeah,
And so you were saying that, I remember you saying that one of your professors actually required you to write free verse for a
yeah,
year. So
yeah. He wouldn't let me write any
I have
poem.
not read, yeah, I have not read the entire collection yet because you don't want to eat all the good chocolates all at once.
I
But
do get that.
so far, I have not found a free verse. So this book is all form, right? Because that's where your heart really beats is form.
Yeah, and a lot of these are nonce forms that I kind of made up myself. Um, so they're not really, you can't look at them and say, oh, this is a 14th century form from Italy, blah blah blah. Some of them you can, but a lot of them are my own invented forms.
Okay, well,
All of them.
let me
Go ahead.
let me just say that even if it was an Italian form or something, I wouldn't be able to look at it and say that. But thank you for
That's
the
okay. That's
assumption
okay.
of knowledge. That's so cool that you made up your own forms. Have you named them?
No, I haven't. A lot of them are just. I mean, a lot of them are not, they're not particularly rigorous. I just work better when I have a form. So even something like, I have this long poem called Candles, and it's 14 8-line stanzas. When I first wrote it, it was a syllabic poem, meaning that each line was counted with a certain number of syllables. And then in the editing process, the syllabic element got edited out, which is actually pretty typical of syllabic poets. um,
Uh-huh.
Probably one of the most famous syllabic poets is Marianne Moore, an American poet, 20th century, and she would do the same thing to where she would write these really rigorous syllabic forms and then edit them down. So really, there's just traces of the form that remain. But that was her structure for getting her thoughts in order. So yeah, so none of these are, the kind of free verse where there's really no discernible form. But some of
Right.
them, like Daybreak in Breton or Active Poetry, they're fairly loose
Okay.
formal poems. Yeah.
So how would you define form then? Because it sounds like when I say form, I just mean rhythm and structure. But for
Sure.
you, like because you have the master, you have more background in the terminology than probably a lot of our listeners have. So, um, yeah. So how would you define form for the listener who's like me, who's not sure what?
No, that's a good
Yeah.
question. If I say that something is a formal poem, I mean that in its entirety it corresponds to some sort of form that's already determined. So it might be a form as general as the heroic line, iambic pentameter, meaning
Right.
that every line in the poem has 5 feet and is made up of iambs.
Hmm.
Like you find a lot of Shakespeare is just written in iambic pentameter. not rhymed. There's not necessarily other stuff going on, but that is a form that you can work in. Or there's also much more rigorous forms like a sonnet, a villanelle, a sestina, where there's particular rhyme schemes or repeated words or just these really strict rules that you have to follow as you're composing the poem.
Right.
Then there's kind of more like what you're describing, which would be, I kind of describe it, this is sort of my own phrase. I describe what you're talking about as like buried Baroque forms.
Okay.
Where the poet is clearly aware of form and is invoking form at points throughout the poem, but it's not like every line corresponds to a particular exterior structure.
Okay.
Or the other phrase for it that's pretty widely used is ghost meter. Where you've got a poem that it's not, you can't really, it's called scanning, when you can go through and you can scan a poem and mark where's the accent, where's the non-accent, that kind of a thing. You can't really scan a poem and find a discernible pattern necessarily, but you might find like, oh, there's a pulse to it, or there's music or something, and that's a ghost meter. I can't not write with ghost meters. It just always will have. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I hope that's helpful.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, good.
Yeah. So you were talking about the theme. I like the way it's described on the back of your book. Also, the mysterious relationship between change and repetition. Seemingly contradictory, these two weave together so tightly in human existence that they cannot be separated. It occurs to me that really does point to faith, and that's almost theological in nature, to see the relationship between things, but also the mystery in that relationship. And so I think, yeah. Do you have anything to add to that? Like, or did I make you think of anything by saying that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right to point to nature, because nature it's a series of cycles, and every cycle is different, and it's a strange thing that we live in, where we will get the spring every year, but every spring feels a little different and looks a little different, comes at a different time, even smells a little different. And I think when I started having children, and kind of went into that next swing of the cycle. And I don't think this is just me. It's such a transformative moment when you have your own children, or you know, if you're a religious celibate or a secular celibate of some kind, but you've made that commitment of what you're going to do with your body and with your time. And you're no longer kind of running around trying to figure out what you're doing with it, but you know what you're doing.
That's a good point.
And then and then you can begin to look back, and you see yourself as entering a chain of people who've come before you, and you can understand those people who came before you so much better, because each of them made that choice as well. And they maybe made a different choice, or they made it very differently, but you understand both the similarities that you share with them, and also you see more clearly the ways that you're fundamentally different from them. And I think that's so fascinating. And for me, my mother got cancer. She was diagnosed with cancer when my son, my oldest child, was about 6 months old, or I guess 8 months old. And then she died when my daughter, my next child, was 2. And it was just so very much to deal with me beginning to enter the stage of my life where I was finally beginning to look like her and live like her, the way that I knew her, because I only ever knew her as a mom.
Right.
So I was just beginning to be like, oh, I get you. And then she was gone.
Right.
So there's a lot of that in the collection. And it's definitely it's not a memoir collection. It's not really about my mom, but my mom is in a lot of the poems in that way of like, she's inhabiting them. So, yeah, I don't know if that is helpful.
It absolutely makes sense. It actually reminds me of another question I was going to ask, because and I mean, I have a feeling you're going to say, not any one of these is the solo answer. But I was just wondering, when you go to write a poem, if you begin, like, where do you begin with it? Does it come from a feeling, like what you were just describing sounds like a lot of, or and I did see like some of your poems about, I think the one in the sandbox, and you see that, like, the contrast between the loss of the mother and then your children growing, and so those poems seem to have come from a feeling. Are there some poems that come from um, sight, I guess, like noodles falling in your apartment? Or do you ever start a poem with just a word that you're like, ooh, I love the sound of that word, like avocado? No.
Yeah.
Just,
I know a lot of
yeah.
poets who actually do that. I don't do that.
The
I
word thing you don't?
I don't. No, I
Okay.
don't. I always start with my poems always start with a feeling, but it's not even necessarily a feeling that I have had. It's more a feeling that I want the reader to have.
Oh,
So I know how I want to make the reader feel. And then it's a matter of, so it usually comes from, I had an experience or saw an image or something, read something, and it gave me a certain feeling. And I want to be able to give that feeling to the reader. But the problem is that the thing that it's not always a one-to-one correlation. So I can't always say, oh, well, I saw this bird and it made me feel this way, so therefore I'm going to make sometimes it's more like, oh, that was a distinct feeling. And then I have to begin to look for what image is going to be a better vehicle almost than the one that gave it to me. I don't know if that makes sense.
that absolutely makes sense. And what I
Okay.
find really fascinating is that, as you and I both know, and writing is such a solitary
Yeah.
activity, but then the way you describe it, I feel similar when I don't write poetry, but I'm very often thinking of, how is this going to impact the reader? I think it's more concentrated, I would say, and intense in a poetry context, because for a novel writer, I'm more thinking of,
Mm.
there are some scenes that I want to make sure I'm
Mhm.
getting the right feeling across. You don't want them to laugh when it's supposed to be a sad scene. That's
Yeah.
a, concrete example. But that's so
Yeah.
fascinating for me that you start with that community aspect of art.
Yeah, I really do. That's where I think at the bottom, I think I'm a dramatist.
Oh, okay.
Because what I'm doing is about drawing out parts of other people. So when I write a poem, I always imagine it being spoken, and I want a certain emotional resonance to come
Hmm.
from it, which is when you write a speech in a play, you want to write it so that they laugh at the right time, they cry at the right time. You want to
Uh-huh.
be doing those things. And I think that I didn't realize that that's not something that all poets do. I
Mm.
thought that was just poetry, but I think it probably comes from, I mean, start way back at the beginning when I started reading poetry. I was reading Aeschylus and Sophocles and Shakespeare, and I was reading verse dramatists, and I thought, oh, this is
Hmm.
just how poetry works. Yeah, but that's always where I start. And I know a lot of poets who start with an image or start with a word, and that's wonderful. And it's not and sometimes I try that and I just can't get in that way. But
I'm so glad I asked
well,
that question. I didn't know it was going to be such a fascinating answer. I love that. Well, and that
well,
makes
good.
me think of the poetry reading that we recently had, and it was you debuting your book, but we also had two other poets, our own Christina
Mhm.
Brown, and then Anthony. I forgot his last
Anthony
name.
Ashley.
Anthony Ashley,
Yeah.
and I don't think I've ever, or no, I haven't. I've never been to a poetry reading. Um, of that nature. And I loved how there was a theme for the evening of seasons, and each of you got up and read. And are you doing that is that something that you've been doing as a way to get the word out about your book? Is that one of, especially since, as you said, and I agree with you, you definitely are a verse dramatist. Is that like your vehicle, your preferred vehicle for getting your book out there?
I
Poetry
should be
reading?
doing more readings. I'm doing one on July 6th with a friend of mine. She's coming, and we're doing one here in Detroit. Part of the issue is that I really prefer doing readings with other poets. I don't like doing a reading that's just one poet. It just doesn't make sense to me, because poetry it's supposed to be a polyphonous experience. You're supposed to have many voices. I mean, a single poem has many, many voices. There's allusions to other poets, and there's lines being quoted, and it's kind of like jazz. You go listen to a jazz concert and you hear lines from other jazz standards and things. So I don't like doing readings by myself, and it's sometimes hard to organize a reading with multiple poets. But I've got the one in July, and then I have another one in September in Ann Arbor. So I've got a couple things on the radar. I need to get more. I just haven't had time because I'm trying to finish this silly play. So I always finish one project and then immediately start the next one. So I don't never have time to adequately promote the one I just finished.
Right. Well, I love that, yeah, it definitely had an impact that it was 3 poets, as you
Yeah.
said.
It's so much more fun.
Yeah, and it's sort of like harmony, like each one of you played up the other ones. It like accentuated the others because of the contrast, and um, as you said, the different voices. So you highlighted and complimented one another. So you mentioned your little play you're working on now. So I said we were going to talk about this, but so you, as I said, you're a poet, a playwright, and a critic. And your first play, of course, was in verse. Do you want to tell the audience, if they don't know, about that one?
Sure. Yeah. It's called Sonne le Matina, which is in French. And I shouldn't have given it a French title because no one can spell it.
Yeah, but as soon as you say it's Frere Jacques, at least then I know how to say it.
It's the last line from the song, Frere Jacques.
Right.
Exactly.
Because it means sound the bells, right?
Ring the matins bells. Ring the matins bells. Yep. So that's actually a Counter-Reformation song dating from the 1500s. So the play is John Calvin, who's famously the founder of Calvinism, a famous reformer, Ignatius of Loyola, who's a Catholic saint, Counter-Reformation founder of the Jesuits, and then Francois Rabelais, who's a French comic novelist. The 3 of them in my play get mixed up in a murder mystery on Mardi Gras, and they're all implicated to some degree or another, and they have to kind of sort out whose responsibility is what, and how are they going to deal with this before Lent starts the next morning. So, and it's all written in verse, and each of them speaks in a different meter, and it's very much of I kind of describe it as like if T.S. Eliot were really, really funny and wrote No Exit. That's kind of, it's a very claustrophobic play.
Yes.
It's a one act, but it's an hour to an hour and 10 minutes long. So it's grueling for the actors to do 70 minutes of rapid fire verse with no break, and like they barely get to go off stage for the whole time. It's just boom, boom, boom. It's grueling for the audience because they're sitting there listening to this, and it's supposed to feel that way. So it's kind of a pressure cooker of a situation. I love it. It's just such a fun little play.
Well, I do too. I got to play the dead body for one of the
did.
readings.
You played it beautifully.
I know. It was grueling, as you said. No. Now, I wanted to go back because I remember I asked you about this before. I'm like, how? Because I was like, that must have been so hard to write each of them in a different meter. But you said they just came out of your head that way.
Yeah, they did. They really did. They kind of wrote themselves. They like wrote their own speeches. And then when because I always write by hand in a notebook and not I'm not lineated.
Right.
And then but I do write in meter kind of just naturally. I write in meter. So then I go back and I look at, a prose paragraph. It's an unlineated paragraph. And I try to look for where's a natural line break here, and then count up the feet and see, okay, what kind of meter is this person speaking in? And they all just had their own. It was so easy. They just had their own. Yeah, well, I say that now. It probably was harder than I remember, but
yeah,
it felt easy, especially in comparison to this new play. It felt much easier.
Yeah. And so the new play, you're bringing back Rabelais. I feel like you are going to be the reason that people realize who Rabelais is, because nobody knows.
This is my goal.
That is your goal?
I want to lead like a Rabelais Renaissance.
Yes, this is what I want. A Rabelais Renaissance
into the 22nd century. I want people to be. I want people to say. I want normal people who are, fairly well informed to be able to speak about the difference between the historical Rabelais and Scharl's Rabelais. Because I want them to see my Rabelais and be like, well, how close is this guy to real life? And then go learn about him.
Oh my gosh, that's what I want. That. Scharl's Rabelais.
I love him. I just love him so much. And he really is my Rabelais. He is very much based on the historical character, but he's also mine. So somebody could have fun figuring out what some of the prominent differences are. But
so tell us the premise of the one you're working on, because your goal is to do a trilogy, right? And this is the second?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, this is the second, and it's called The Death of Rabelais. And they each take place on a prominent feast eve.
Okay.
So this one is the eve of Epiphany. So that's 12th night. Epiphany Eve is 12th night.
Okay.
So it's the end of the Christmas season, and Rabelais is traditionally there would be these big Epiphany or 12th night gatherings where people would wear costumes and they would have these big they'd have big bonfires and they would put on plays and do that's why in 12th night there's a lot of costumes and gender swapping.
Right.
That's very traditional. People would wear gender swap costumes, those kinds of things. So in the play, Rabelais is journeying across France. It's not really clear at the beginning why, but he's clearly in a hurry. And what's happened is he's lost a patron and he's fleeing to Germany to try to get another patron. And this happened to him repeatedly. And he would lose protection of a patron, and then he would be under attack either by Protestants or by Catholics, because they all hated him and loved him. So everybody hated and loved him. So he's booking it across France. He gets caught in a blizzard and he falls in with this strange character who's dressed as Death, wearing a Death costume. Rabelais is wearing a jester costume. Of course, yeah. And then there's this other fellow who's a friar who Rabelais ends up their acquaintances. And through a series of circumstances, Rabelais and Death end up switching costumes. So Rabelais is now dressed as Death, and this character is dressed as a jester. And then they all go with this friar to an Epiphany party and join the Epiphany party. And it becomes clear that the Death character, who is now dressed as the jester, is in fact Death and has come to take somebody. And throughout the evening, they're doing all these traditional Epiphany games. There's a play within the play. So they all have their costumes, but then they all wear different costumes within the play.
Okay.
So you have Death dressed as a jester, but playing God the Father. Or you have Rabelais dressed as Death, but playing Wisdom. Or just these really fascinating little things.
I think you might be explaining why this one is trickier to write.
It's so hard, Mandy. It's so hard. So there's the play within the play, and then eventually Death says, okay, well, I'm really Death, and I've got to kill one of you. So here we go. And it all kind of blows sky high from there.
That's great.
It's very, I told my husband, I was like, I want to write something that's more plot driven, just has more plot. Because Sonia Le Mattina not a lot happens. So I told him I want there to be a lot of plot. I want there to be violence and blood and all this stuff. And now I'm knee deep in blood. And I'm this is the most frustrating thing ever. But I got what I wanted.
So are they, do they each have their own meter again, or?
Currently they do not.
Okay.
I'm just trying to get a draft done. I have 2 scenes left.
Okay.
I'm so close. I can
that's
taste it. And once it's done, there are 8 characters. They will not all have their own meter. It's more like, what I'm sensing is that it's more like whoever, the meters, the forms change slightly, mostly between pentameter and tetrameter. So 5 beats per line or 4 beats per line, which really does change the emotional pull of a speech. You might think it's just a academic thing, but it really does change the feeling. So it goes back and forth between those, and sometimes it's rhymed and sometimes it's not. And it usually comes down to who has sort of like emotional control of the situation.
Okay.
They determine how everyone else speaks. And then as the emotional control switches to another character, then it might switch.
Okay.
So it's much more social and emotional, the way that the forms work, instead of character driven.
Do you know what? I think that makes a lot of sense, because based on Sunning Them with Tina, the 3 men really were, the way that they were speaking, they were arguing for much of the play. And so that just makes sense to me that each of them was stuck in their own pattern. So it was relational, but not really, because they were each insisting on their own way. But with this one, there's so much more mix up that just makes more organic sense, the way you just
I'm really glad
it.
to hear that.
Yeah.
It makes sense to me, but
well, there you go.
You shall see.
That's good. And then there will be a third, but maybe let's save that one. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't really have the plot worked out at all, but I know it's called Rabelais in Love.
Rabelais in Love. Oh my goodness.
Yes.
I'm so excited.
Yes. Don't you want to read it? I want to read it too.
I want to read it. That's why I write. Like when I really get to writing, I'm like, it's the reader in me that is the engine. When I
want to know what's going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I can't outline, because then I don't care. Yeah. But anyway, no, it's totally like, what is this person going to do? So when I get uptight and I'm having a hard time writing, that's when I realize I'm not being Mandy the reader. I need to calm down and be Mandy the reader and just write for the love of story and
be excited about it.
Yeah, and be excited about. I'm just always wanting to know who the people are, like and how they're going to handle the stuff I make them deal with. So I also you also said you are working on a novel that's been in the works or in your mind for a while. Are you putting that aside at the moment, or are you doing everything all at once?
Well, I'm not doing anything right now except the play, because I have to have it done. It's just driving me nuts.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping to finish it in the next, honestly, 2 weeks. And then do a serious rewrite and be done with it by mid-August. Be done with the draft. So then I have a maternity leave. I'm having a baby in October.
Woo-woo.
So I have a maternity leave from work. And of course I'm like, ooh, how am I going to use my maternity leave besides, sleeping? But I'm toying with working on a novel at that point. And it would actually probably be a different novel. The one that I've been working on, it's funny, you get to the point where you just know you're not emotionally ready for the piece. And it's a novel about marriage, and I'm just not ready to write it yet. We're coming up on our 10th anniversary, and I'm thinking maybe at our 20th, I'll be able to write this.
Yeah.
But for now, I'm just not ready yet. But the other novel idea that I have is about death and about dealing with the death of a loved one and the long drawn out death of a loved one. And that I think I could tackle at this point. So yeah, and it's going to be really fun. If I can pull it off, it's going to be really, really cool. I actually conceive of it, first of all, as a libretto for an opera. But I think I'm going to try to write it as a novel and then redo it as an opera, just because there's really such a small audience for opera.
Yeah.
And I think if I establish interest in the story as a novel, and then I could maybe have better luck at actually getting it staged as an opera.
Oh, that would be excellent.
We'll see. Wouldn't that be amazing?
I love that you're, and I remember we talked about this before, you and I, maybe on a pod, maybe not, but that you are just in love with the process itself of writing.
Oh, I love it.
And I think that's so great because too often I get, in the house I was raised in, it was always like, well, why are you doing that? Meaning, what is the payoff going to be? Like, what is the point of how you're spending your time? And you have really helped me as a friend and as a fellow writer to say, well, the point, it really is okay if the point is the writing. That's okay. Yep. And then because you have that attitude, I think that is why you are so prolific and so free with your ideas. And I think that's how God made you. And that's why you're finding success, because you're not paralyzed by, but what if what I'm doing right now doesn't matter? It matters because you're doing it right now. Right?
That's really sweet. Yeah. There's an artist, his name's Amit Majmudar. Okay. He's a poet. He's everything. He lives in Ohio. And he is this par excellence. I mean, the guy, he publishes like 2 books a year.
Wow.
And it's insane. And he's always working in some new form or doing some kind of wacky new project, or he like whips out something in a genre he's never worked in before, and it's pristine. And I'm so inspired just by kind of like what you were saying. I've just been so inspired just by watching his career over the last 10 years and seeing, oh my gosh, there are no rules. Like, this guy does whatever the heck he wants to do. And it's incredible. So I think you're right. Like, there are some artists who manage to just make things and not worry about it. And it is really, really cool. I definitely want to be like that. So that's really sweet.
I think you are. So
thank you. That's really sweet.
Definitely.
Well, you should check out Amit's stuff. Amit is incredible.
I will get you to text me that name later.
I will.
So I want to go back to your poetry book, because ostensibly that was what we were going to talk about. But there's just so much to you, Jane. So I would just like to know, do you have a favorite, or would that be like asking you if your Leo or Stella is your favorite kid? Or the one
depends on the day.
Yeah. So do you have one that maybe favorite is the wrong word, but is there one that best conveys the overall theme, or just one that you are affectionate toward?
I really love the title poem, Pawns.
Yeah.
It's such a weird poem, and I couldn't believe that somebody wanted to publish it. That somebody wanted to publish a 4-page dramatic monologue in the voice of Theoderic the Ostrogoth. I just was blown away that someone wanted to take it. But I love it. I love this poem. It seems to me it kind of encompasses. I think I'll be writing around this poem for another 10 or 15 years, just the things that I got to. And I wrote it really I wrote it originally as a dialogue, actually, between 2 characters. And then I realized that the character who was set up as the antagonist in the dialogue was actually my favorite. So I just cut the protagonist, basically.
Oh, that's so great.
Yeah, and I just made the antagonist. It gave him like a 4-page speech, and it was so fun.
Do you know what I think? I mean, this, and I do think that this one, Pawns, it's page 68, people, when you get your copy. I think that this one is very, I can't think of a word right now, but it's proof of what you were saying before, that you're a dramatic. Yeah. It really is a very dramatic poem. I could see someone using this as an audition.
Yeah, it's super speakable. Yes. And it's it's actually not formal. There isn't really any form to it.
Oh,
It
yeah,
doesn't
you're
have
right.
a regular meter. It has occasional rhymes, but it's really not. But I haven't been able to find that voice again. Honestly, that kind of
Oh, well, he said what he wanted
just.
to say.
I know. I guess I did.
He
I've been
moved
working on
on.
these poems about Saint Joan of Arc, and I've been trying to get back to that voice for these poems, and I got it for a minute, and then it went away again. So I got to keep working on it.
Well, and there was one poem I remember that you read. I don't remember which one it was, but you read it at your poetry night, and you said that it was a form that was really challenging, and you did it because someone said you wouldn't be able to.
Yeah. It's a sestina. It's called postpartum.
Okay.
Yep. And the form's called a sestina. And somebody said something like, "Oh, nobody writes. I think they said nobody writes sestinas with like true emotions or something like that."
Oh, and you were
like,
like,
"Well, I do."
hold my beard.
It's such a stinker. I don't know if it has true emotions, but I like it.
Oh, it does. No, I love it.
Thanks.
Yeah. Well,
I do think that's a fun thing to do too, though, as an artist, is listen to what people say you can't do and then just say, "Well, I don't know. Let's try it. Why
you
not?"
know what? I have never done anything in my life with that attitude. And I think I'm
Oh,
going
really?
to.
Oh,
No, that is
you
not.
should.
I'm going to do that now. I'm going to try that. I'll let you know.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to
And it
look.
might not work, but it's worth trying.
But see, and that right there is the attitude that you have that I think so many artists we would have so much more art if more of us would stop paralyzing ourselves with wondering, what is this good for, or will it be good at all?
Yeah.
And so the joy of making, and it's worth it to try regardless of what happens after, is such a beautiful attitude. And it's one of my favorite things about you
Oh, thanks.
in general.
That's really sweet.
So, well, things are winding down. It looks like Aloysius the bear has had way too much ale. He doesn't look so good. He was our third person at the table. But thank you so much, Jane, for spending this time with me. I wish we were in the exact same room together, but maybe soon.
Me too.
So,
Oh, it was a delight.
yes, it was a delight. And things, as you can tell, are winding down here at the Anselm Society Digital Pub. The fire is down to embers. The customers are trundling home. Aloysius the bear has polished off his final glass. Once again, Believe to See is a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. If you have a minute, we would love for you to rate and review the show on Spotify, iTunes, or wherever you get your podcast. Please check the show notes for links as to where to find Jane and her wonderful writing. Thank you so much for listening, and we will catch you next time.